To the valiant souls who've marched under the colors of their nation's flag, I send a sailor's salute. It's not a life I'd have chosen, nor one I'd ask of my kin, but my old man, he wore the uniform with pride. That spirit of his, it casts a long shadow over the tale I'm about to spin. A yarn set upon the vast, unforgiving Pacific, where the depths hold secrets far stranger than any landlocked ghost story. I'm pulling this from the cobwebbed corners of memory, from a ledger best left closed, but it's time it was told. I'm Specialist Mac MacGuffin, and if I've ever done anything foolhardy, it was getting caught shooting up in a school parking lot. That's what landed me on a ship larger than any place I'd called home. At 26, you'd think I'd know better, but there I was, getting a hard lesson in Uncle Sam's version of liberty. I won't bore you with the sob story. America's got a heartache for the underdog, but only from a safe distance. You see, I wasn't looking for redemption or some drummed-up glory. I just wanted a second chance, and the judge offered it in a uniform. I joined the ranks, not as a hero or a villain, but as just another face in the sea of many, trying to dodge a worse fate. We're not all cut from the same cloth. The military's a patchwork of souls with reasons as varied as the stars. Some there for a shot at a better life, others to escape the past or chase a darker nature. But let's not mince words. The brass might sell you a story of honor and duty, but we all know where the paycheck comes from and whose pockets it's really lining. Every time you wince at the bite taken from your earnings, remember where it's going. I wasn't called to serve by some higher purpose. My only creed was survival, and that meant playing by the rules, even when they handed me a non-disclosure form thicker than a steak at the mess hall. I signed on the dotted line and stepped into a world apart, a world where things happen that don't fit neatly into the evening news. So here I sit in my quarters, racing against the clock to document the chaos that's torn through this vessel in the past day. We've still got our phones and laptops, for now. It's just a matter of time before they remember to strip us of these digital lifelines, so I'm typing like hell's at my heels, ready to send this off to a buddy stateside before wiping it from my machine forever. Forgive the rush of words and any slips of the tongue. There's no time for polishing when hell's knocking on your door. We were deep in the Pacific. I mean, so far out you'd forget land was a thing. Playing chicken with the Russians. Nothing but blue as far as the eye could see. If you've ever been truly alone, out in the wilds where civilization's just a rumor, you might catch a whisper of what it feels like out here. Even with over 300 souls packed into this steel beast, the isolation can creep up on you. I was aboard the USS Barry, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, and we were facing off with a Kashin-class Russian ship, which I'll just nickname the PTSD for the sake of civility. We were a couple of days into this chest-thumping exercise when the routine was shattered by a distress call. A Swedish tanker, the Nani, had hit some kind of snag, something about a whale. It didn't add up. Those tankers are behemoths, and no sea creature would make more than a dent. Our childish contest suddenly turned into a race of rescue. We tore through the water, both our ship and the PTSD, charging north like knights to a damsel's aid. The rumors of the Russian ship's prowess weren't just talk. They took the lead. Below decks, the engines roared their challenge, but I couldn't help but think our captain might be biting back a curse or two. In times of doubt, though, the Navy takes to the skies, because when the sea's mysteries call, sometimes you have to look from above to find the answers. Continuing from the thrilling escapades aboard our ship, it was indeed a product of my imagination. Yet it was the necessity of the hour, for we knew well that racing against the Russian captain would lead us nowhere. Captain Diomedes, with a strategic twist, summoned one of our aerial sentinels, a seabird, our trusted helicopter. It surged into the sky with a might that left both the vessels trailing in its wake, a metallic streak against the blue. As the chopper charged ahead, an ominous phenomenon caught my attention, a vast, dense fog that loomed large on the northern horizon. It wasn't just another maritime mist. This was a colossal curtain of haze, so thick and extensive that it seemed an entity unto itself, a wall without apparent beginning or end. It sprawled across our view, covering the expanse both eastward and westward, its towering stature extending up to where the clouds lay brooding, casting everything beyond a mile to the north into obscurity. The visibility there was naught but nil, an absolute void. It was in the midst of this eerie scene that Lieutenant Michael Riggs made his silent approach, seemingly appearing out of thin air next to me. He was a man with the stealth of a shadow, slipping unnoticed into gatherings, leaving people startled once they realized his presence, usually mid-conversation. His casual greeting, "Howdy, McMuffin," carried a touch of humor, with McMuffin being the moniker I had somehow earned aboard this floating fortress. His attention drifted to the looming fog as he casually remarked on checking the situation topside. In response, I hastily confirmed that all was indeed well, at least until he mused about the tanker we were meant to intercept, still out of sight, thankfully. Yet, before I could formulate any further response, our interaction was interrupted by First Class Petty Officer John Spoon Witherspoon. We usually called him Spoon or Spoony, owing to his British upbringing on an American military base, which lent him an accent that seemed tailor-made for maritime life. Spoony's voice cut through the calm, commanding attention toward the port side. As the crew shifted to observe, exclamations erupted, particularly from Cole, who was perched above us. The source of their alarm was unclear to me at first, until I caught sight of it. The grotesque remains of a humpback whale, ghastly butchered and sprawled open upon the ocean's surface. We were mercifully spared from the full horror of its belly-up position, which would have offered a much more macabre view. The assault on our senses intensified as we neared the carcass. The stench that emanated from it was indescribable, a foul, potent miasma that could only be likened to diving headfirst into a compost heap in the height of summer's swelter, magnified 100-fold. The ships began to decelerate, prompting a vocal complaint from Cole, who was none too pleased about approaching the stench even more closely. Spoony, with grim acceptance, pointed out the macabre scene unfolding between us and the carcass, a veritable sea of death and decay. The ocean before us was littered with a diverse, yet uniformly deceased array of marine life. An aquatic apocalypse before our eyes. Speculation arose among the crew, with Rick pondering out loud whether this was the doing of some negligent oil company. As we trudged through this graveyard of sea creatures, the ship herself seemed to struggle against the morbid obstacle course, reminding us, despite her might, that she was not designed to navigate through such a ghastly obstacle course. Our seabird, the chopper, hovered with caution as the fog's dense mass loomed over it like a tyrant over its domain. The silence of the scene was abruptly shattered by the sounds of someone retching near the starboard bow. Even the steely nerves of sailors were not immune to the visceral reaction such a sight and smell could evoke. But it was in the belly of this chaos that an even more bizarre sight caught my eye. It was another humpback, or what was left of it, and from its carcass sprouted what appeared to be plant life. A grotesque parody of nature, a tree of sorts with a trunk so twisted and branches so sickly, it seemed a mockery of life itself. Our musings were interrupted by the distant cries of gulls, an incongruous sound given our distance from any land. Yet the calls grew louder, more numerous, and it was clear. A flock was descending upon us from within the suffocating embrace of the fog. As the gulls broke through the misty barrier, we instinctively raised our weapons, not in aggression, but in a primal reaction to the unexpected, the absurdity of being threatened by mere birds in the midst of the ocean's vastness. I could almost hear Staff Sergeant Alden's imagined reprimand for such a reflex, yet he did not emerge. Instead, we all stood, a collection of sailors, momentarily united in our bewilderment as the sky above became filled with the silhouettes of winged scavengers emerging from the fog. From the depths of the ocean's embrace, as we stood marooned amidst a feast for winged scavengers, the uproar only grew in tenacity. "How many of them are there, Spoon?" he asked, his voice strained with vexation. Spoon, with a furrowed brow, attempted a quick tally, but the number of seagulls was overwhelming. "I reckon there's at least 100 of the blasted creatures up there," he shouted over the din, his British lilt surfacing in his agitation. Cole, standing nearby with his arms crossed, nodded towards the detritus floating around us. "Yeah, it's a bloody banquet for them," he muttered, his gaze following a gull as it swooped lower. A smorgasbord laid out courtesy of the deceased sea-dwellers. Spoon turned towards me, a grim expression on his face. "You think those birds are foolish enough to feast on this contaminated spread, Professor?" he asked. But before I could craft a response, as if nature itself wanted to answer his inquiry, the lead seagull released a droplet from the sky. We watched the white splatter descend gracefully through the air, falling over 100 feet before striking the deck with an audible splat directly in front of Spoon. "Why that little?" Spoon began, his indignation cut short as another avian offering struck his shoulder. "Off!" he shouted, the obscenity lost in the wind. Despite the grimness of our situation, I chuckled, earning a sharp glare from Spoon. "It's not funny, you wanker," he yelled, his voice rising above the squawking and the sound of the ocean, as he tore off his soiled jacket. The rest of the crew couldn't contain their mirth either, but our amusement was abruptly severed as dozens, no, scores of the birds began to fall from the sky. They descended like drops during a light summer sprinkle. "Oh, shit," Rick said, the expletive barely doing the situation justice. Suddenly, guano began striking the deck around us, and the air was filled with the cacophony of countless birds overhead. We could see at least 50 birds passing overhead, with what seemed to be at least 100 more behind them, a relentless army in the skies. It was as if they were moving in unison, and the light drizzle of waste turned into a steady pour. Doubling over, retching from the smell and the grotesque spectacle, it seemed the gulls had coordinated their own form of an aerial onslaught. With my vantage point on the deck, I felt more than saw the grim cascade. "Watch out!" someone yelled, but their warning was drowned by the gulls' relentless assault. As the bulk of the seagulls passed overhead, what had started as a bizarre inconvenience turned into a literal storm of feces. We weren't supposed to abandon our posts, but instinct took over. Several crew members ran frantically for cover, slipping and sliding across the guano-covered deck, some losing their footing and crashing to the ground with considerable force. I removed my jacket in a futile attempt to shield myself from the onslaught, using it as a makeshift umbrella. I'd like to think I remained at my post out of duty, but in truth, I stayed put because Riggs was beside me, unflinching amidst the chaos. "This reminds me of the last time I saw my ex-wife," Rick shouted, trying to inject humor into the dire situation, his own jacket hoisted as a meager shield from the downpour. Just then, the calm was shattered by the radio crackling to life. All hands, prepare for emergency landing." The urgency in the transmission was palpable. "The hell?" Riggs muttered, echoing the confusion we all felt. Seconds later, our Seahawk helicopter burst from the fog, a beast in agony. We hadn't heard her approach over the pandemonium. But there she was, lurching toward us with a desperate, erratic energy. Squinting against the onslaught from above, I struggled to make sense of the scene unfolding. The chopper was plastered with blood, feces, and feathers. Even from this distance, it was evident that the windshield was obscured by a college of bird remains. "Damn it!" Rich bellowed, everyone into the deckhouse, on the double. His voice barely cut through the noise. It was clear that not everyone heard him, but those who did made a break for it, staggering as the world around us descended into pandemonium. I remained partially spellbound, my movements sluggish, as I watched the helicopter's perilous descent. Reax, acting on pure instinct, dashed forward, waving and shouting at the oblivious crew members. The chopper was descending rapidly, trailing black smoke from her rotors. The blaring sound of the impact alarm jolted me from my daze. She was going to crash, and it was going to be catastrophic. Without thought, I turned and began to sprint. I might have previously mentioned that my days of substance abuse hadn't prepared me for such exertions. I was more accustomed to the inertia of couches than the adrenaline of crisis. Hence, it was only after a few labored steps that I slipped, a victim to the slick mess the gulls had left behind. I went airborne for a moment, the deck and the darkening sky exchanging places before my eyes. The back of my head met the deck with a thud, and darkness enveloped me. I can't say how long I lay unconscious, nor could anyone else. Most were preoccupied with the $42.9 million worth of military hardware colliding with the $1.8 billion carrier. In the end, the more costly war machine proved its resilience. Later, I learned that the Seahawk had hit the deck sideways, initiating a destructive spiral across the lower deck. The blades, made of composite materials, titanium and steel, snapped off one after another, turning into deadly projectiles that flew across the deck at blinding speeds. One 6-foot piece managed to embed itself into the structure of the SLQ-32 electronic warfare system's antenna. By some miracle, there was only one fatality amongst the pilots. The other aviator, co-pilot specialist Billy Hamilton, somehow managed to leap from the cockpit seconds before the impact. Spoon later recounted how he'd witnessed the entire thing, and I recorded his words verbatim for posterity. Although it disrupts the pacing of the story, it's crucial to note this event, as it becomes exceedingly relevant later on. The testimony of Specialist John Spoon Witherspoon was as follows. I was utterly spellbound. Mate. The chopper was careening towards us, right? But when Hamilton bailed out, I couldn't peel my eyes away. Watching him spin through the air, I thought he was a goner. But then, the most astonishing thing happened. Directly below him was a dead humpback whale, and protruding from its belly was one of those bizarre tree-like fungi. It was enormous, like something out of Super Mario Brothers. Hamilton crashed through that mushroom canopy, which seemed to bend and cushion his descent before he hit the whale. The carcass was so decomposed that he went straight through it and into the water. When he surfaced a moment later, I was in disbelief. It was the luckiest escape I'd ever witnessed, and that was Spoon's account, word for word. It took the chopper's crash into the deckhouse to snap Spoon back to reality. When I came to, I found Call and Riggs looming over me, concern etched on their faces. It seemed that my fall had been serendipitous, as the Seahawk had narrowly missed me, my prone form escaping its deadly path. Yet, we were on the cusp of an even graver predicament. Fire control teams were already smothering the flames that had erupted from the wrecked Seahawk, their efforts sending plumes of black smoke into the sky, mingling with the encroaching fog. The sky, which had been a clear azure, now darkened ominously. Medical staff scurried about, attending to the injured, having just retrieved Billy Hamilton from the water's embrace. As I steadied myself on my feet, surveying the havoc that surrounded us, the impact alarm pierced the air once more. "Half-a," Dell murmured, his words hanging like a question. Before anyone could ponder the thought, the radio crackled with urgency again. All hands to stations, all hands to stations. Unidentified craft approaching on a collision vector. With no time to contemplate the bizarre turns of the day, I, along with the rest of the crew, scrambled to our respective battle stations. I manned my station, flicking the safety off Betsy, my trusty mounted gun. Deep below, the vessel braced for whatever strange new threat was emerging from the dense fog that had become a harbinger of chaos. The roar of the engines surged with a vitality that seemed desperate, an iron beast clawing at the laws of physics to evade the inevitable. As the Seahawk's engines bellowed, the vibrations traveled through the deck with such fervor that they felt almost personal. The helicopter turned hard to port, and in the periphery of the unfolding chaos, I caught a glimpse of Riggs drawing his pistol, a grim humor in his movements. Then the USS Barry's horn cut through the tension with a resounding blast that rattled my teeth despite the distance from its origin. A brief silence followed, only to be broken by 5 staccato blasts. Command hadn't yet labeled the approaching vessel as hostile. Otherwise, the order to engage would have been given, and our guns would be singing. The fog, thick and obdurate, was pierced by a shape, vast and dreadfully swift, its monstrous silhouette backlit by an eerie green luminescence. Even through the obscuring mists, I could discern an aberrance in its design. A vessel of such size should not move with such predatory haste. The Barry's horn sounded 5 more blasts, its urgent warning mirrored by the PTSD cutter floating about 1/4 of a mile from our starboard side. Though the thrum of the engines vibrated from below, my gut churned with a premonition. We wouldn't escape its path. "Holy shit, she's going too fast," I muttered, watching the approaching behemoth. "Why the hell is she barreling here?" Rick speculated aloud. "Maybe they were lost in the fog," he said, pondering the possibilities. "Perhaps after our Seahawk went down, they followed its distressing wails into the abyss, or the captain, engulfed by fog and fear, has blindly spurred the vessel to breakneck speeds." I could only manage a thoughtful in response, the situation unfolding faster than conversation allowed. Then, like a leviathan lunging from the depths, the behemoth emerged, a mere 100 yards from our position, tearing through the murk with terrifying intent. Shouts erupted across the deck. Rick cursed beside me, his voice lost amidst the cacophony. "That's the freaking Nani, isn't it?" It was, unmistakably, a supertanker, its mass eclipsing anything I'd seen, dwarfing even the storied U.S. Kitty Hawk. But the horror lay not in its size. As the ship drew nearer, the details became grotesque. The hull, a sordid patchwork of corpse blue and rust brown, was corroded to an extent that spoke of abandonment and decay. It was the sight of the bodies, hundreds, maybe thousands, draped across the ship's underside that chilled the soul. They hung there, lifeless ornaments strung without care, reminiscent of tinsel on a Christmas tree. The arrangement was macabre and arbitrary. Some fastened to the rotting steel in a crucifix pose, others entwined in rusty chains, suspended by necks, limbs, reminiscent of some maritime Golgotha. The decision was made. The vessel bore malevolent intent. Moments later, the Bushmaster cannons on starboard barked alive, spitting out bursts of deadly precision. The rounds punctuated the hull, creating gaping wounds where the metal had succumbed to time and neglect. It was Carl, I think, who defied orders and opened up with the M2. Command to fire had not been given. Disciplinary repercussions were sure to follow. Yet, in that instant, such concerns were dwarfed by the need for survival as the entire deck exploded into a din of gunfire. The barrage was, at best, a symbolic defiance. Our small arms fire was nothing to this floating necropolis. If anything could stop it, it would be the Bushmasters, but even punching holes through it at this range seemed a futile effort. Despite the frenzy, my eyes were drawn to the superstructure of the supertanker. The rounds, in some places, passed through the steel as if it were mere parchment. I could see rows of basketball-sized holes riddling the ship's corroded flank, an unsettling testament to its decrepit state. Even now, I felt that this behemoth scoffed at the concept of sinking. The PTSD, for its part, contributed potshots with its M240s, but heavy ordnance at such proximity to our vessel was out of the question. Then, as the tanker loomed larger, its vast shadow enveloping us, something caught my attention amidst the chaos. Amidst the towering superstructure, I saw masts, tall, archaic, reminiscent of an 18th century ship of the line, commanded by ghosts yearning for the age of sail. These masts were adorned not with canvas, but with more corpses, strung up in a high rigging, swaying in the breeze as if dancing to the dirge of the sea. The supertanker, a looming colossus, dwarfed us. The USS Barry, though a formidable ship herself, was but a plaything to the Nani. The disparity was humbling. The Barry was a giant among ships, but next to the Nani, we were but minnows to a whale. As the distance closed to 50 feet, the enormity of the Nani blotted out all else. The size difference was staggering. If the Barry was a great white shark, then the Nani was a megalodon, not just any but the cinematic giant from The Meg. And in the absence of a hero from a summer blockbuster to save us, the weight of reality pressed upon our shoulders. The impact alarm blared a dire chorus with the chaos, a final plea to brace for collision. And brace we did, almost in unison, our gunshots faltering, our weapons becoming mere afterthoughts. The U.S. Barry, in one last gasp of defiance, veered past the starboard beam of the Nani, but it was too late. The collision, when it came, was cataclysmic. The world itself seemed to scream in protest as metal met metal, an orchestra of destruction that threw me from my stance, wrenching my fingers from my weapon's grip. I didn't lose consciousness, but for a moment, the disorientation was so complete that I was adrift in a sea of confusion, struggling to remember where I was, or if I was still alive. For what seemed like an eternity, I lay sprawled on the deck, the sky above me swirling in a dizzying whirlpool of blues and grays. A hand clamped onto me, hoisting me up with urgency, and my vision slowly focused to reveal Spoonie's familiar face. I remember the corners of my mouth twitching into a lazy smile, a reflex of affection for the man. Yeah, good old Spoonie, I thought, a great guy amidst the chaos. My uniform was clenched in his fists, his knuckles white with the strain, his eyes wide with a cocktail of fear and adrenaline. He was shouting something fierce and urgent, but my ears rang with the cacophony of disaster, drowning his words in a sea of dissonance. It wasn't until his voice sliced through the fog of my senses that I grasped the gravity of his words. "Let's fucking go," he bellowed, and something in his tone spurred my heart into a gallop. "Go," I parroted back, the words sounding foreign on my tongue. He didn't bother with a verbal response, just a tug that nearly dislocated my shoulder, pulling me toward the starboard side. As I staggered to keep pace with him, the deck was a blur of sailors caught in the throes of panic, their faces etched with the instinctive knowledge that survival was the only currency that mattered now. "How?" I managed to gasp out, even though I was speaking to no one in particular. The ship was sinking. That reality came crashing back to me, a relentless tide that refused to be ignored. "Come on, mate, the ship's going down. We've got to leg it," Spoonie shouted over his shoulder, his words punctuated by the pitch and yaw of the ship as it listed dangerously to port, nearly sending me sprawling for a second time. Spoonie's grip was the only thing that kept me vertical. The stark realization that the U.S. Barry, this behemoth that had been my home for nearly 2 years, my sanctuary through the tumultuous weaning off opiates, my vantage point for countless sunrises and sunsets, might soon be devoured by the abyss, struck me with an almost physical force. The notion was so ludicrous, so surreal, that it seemed the product of a fevered dream. We reached the starboard side, Spoonie's grip never wavering. Without pause, we leaped together, our hands clasped like protagonists in some grand cinematic spectacle, as if I were the fearless love interest, and he the hero in a blockbuster action flick. Falling 50 feet is an experience words can barely capture. It's a descent that seems to mock the very notion of time and space. The impact with the water was a rude awakening to the laws of physics, a harsh slap of reality that enveloped us in a haze of bluish green. Separated from Spoonie by the ferocity of our entry, I found myself alone for a brief moment in the chaotic embrace of the ocean. Around me, the muffled symphony of human desperation played, an orchestra of splashes and distant shouts, while overhead, the percussive boom of an explosion sent tremors through the depths. I was suspended in a world turned alien, my mind caught between terror and awe. But as I looked down, the water transitioned from blue-green to an unfathomable darkness. I gazed into the abyss, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. It was a reminder of our precarious position in this world, more than 400 miles from the nearest land, surrounded by the watery graves of the departed. Staring into the depths, I fancied I saw a monolithic shape stir, a leviathan of the deep that belonged to nightmares and ancient mariners' tales. That sight galvanized my limbs, igniting a primal need for survival. Gasping for air, I resurfaced amidst the flailing forms of sailors and the distant barking of orders. Spoonie's head popped up next to mine, his face a mask of grim determination. "There's something below us," he said, his voice tinged with a fear that sent shivers through my already chilled body. With a shared look that needed no words, we swam for the lifeboats, driven by the unspoken agreement that the open water was no place to linger. I'll skip the details of the chaos that ensued. Suffice it to say, we made it to a lifeboat, heaved aboard by the combined efforts of our comrades and the Russians, all of us haunted by the specter of the Nani and what lay beneath the waves. Despite the pandemonium, the USS Barry stubbornly refused to succumb to the sea. She listed, she groaned, but she remained afloat, defying the odds in our hasty departure from her decks. It was ludicrous. Scores of us had plunged into the depths for naught. The Nani, having unleashed her fury, became an eerie, listless hulk, offering no response to the hails from friend or foe. As the night wrapped around us, the Barry and her battered crew limped away, putting distance between us and the now silent supertanker. Now, past the stroke of midnight, I lie in my bunk, surrounded by the sounds of repairs and the low murmur of voices. Captain Diomedes has called for assistance, but we're told it will be days before help arrives. And the Nani remains a silent enigma, a tomb on the waves. When dawn breaks, we're to board her, a venture into the unknown that I find myself dreading. The captain has chosen me to be part of that party, and while it's an honor, it's also a descent into the heart of darkness, a journey towards something draped in death and mystery. I will update this log if I survive to do so. Today, of all days, the ghost of addiction haunts me, the call of heroin a siren song amidst the storm. But I resist, focusing on the task at hand, preparing to face whatever waits aboard the Nani. This narrative, I realize now, seems to be a prelude to a larger story unfolding. Should you wish to hear more, should you crave to unravel the mystery of the Nani alongside me, then let your voice join the chorus of those who seek the truth. For now, I'll sign off. Those following my journey know the trials of the day, the spill on my bike, the battle scars that mark my flesh, but they have not silenced me. I will return to share the next chapter, should fate allow it. For those who've lent me their ears, who've chosen to navigate these treacherous waters with me, I offer my deepest thanks. Join me on the social waves, engage in the dialogue, share in the music that underscores our tale, and if you dare, send your stories to be shared with the world. Until we meet again, may your dreams be free from the shadows of the deep, and may we all emerge from the abyss unscathed. Good night, and may your tomorrows be bright.